progress should squeeze out our thoughts about well-being and how we can support pupils in that way. So firstly, let's think about how pupils might have experienced lockdown and school closure. I think there's a real mix of evidence coming out in terms of the impact that the COVID crisis is having on pupils, and pupils will sit around along a spectrum of impact. On one end, you'll have pupils that will have really sadly suffered quite considerable stress and trauma. Education Policy Institute in their recent report highlighted the bereavement, anxiety, and abuse that some pupils might have suffered during this time. And schools have done an amazing job since March of really trying to support their most vulnerable pupils, but we are concerned, of course, that some of them might have slipped through the net. Domestic violence reports are up at least 50%, and social services are anticipating a rise in child protection referrals due to some of those vulnerable children becoming invisible during school closures. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got actually pupils who will have thrived through this time of school closure, either because they're taking learning at their own pace, benefiting from spending time with family, or in some really sad cases because they don't actually find school to be a safe and happy place. A report last week by the Department for Education and the University of Oxford actually highlighted a group of these children and called them a happier at home group. So you kind of got those two really different experiences. And actually most pupils will sit somewhere along that spectrum. They'll have had highs and lows and sort of been impacted by lockdown in a variety of ways, depending on their experiences. But further research since March has been showing quite good reason to be concerned about pupils' well-being, and good reason to think that we need to think immediately and in terms of over the summer holidays about how we can support them pastorally. So a recent study that we did with over 2,000 teachers, young people and parents found that nearly 3/4 of teachers are worried about the impact of lockdown on people's safety. I'm sure if a lot of teachers have joined us today, you're not going to be very surprised about that. We also found that in a different study, over half of young people are feeling more anxious than they did before lockdown. And although some of them are also reporting positive trends like enjoying being at home with their family. A third of parents of 5 to 18-year-olds have noticed negative changes in their children's behaviour. So thinking about how we support children with their behaviour and their well-being is also really important. And finally, over a third of children in an April survey reported that they felt lonely during lockdown, which I guess for some adults is something that we can really identify with. But that's a really important finding because a recent study by the University of Bath has looked at the link between isolation and mental health, and they concluded that for those young people that felt isolated and lonely during this time of school closure, they might be more likely to go on to develop depression up to 9 years in the future. So what we're talking about here in terms of supporting people's well-being after this crisis, be that over the summer in summer schools or beyond, is really sort of a matter of quite serious mental health implications. So what does the evidence say about how summer schools could impact on people's well-being and their social and emotional health? So US studies show us that increased learning time programs, so essentially any programs outside of school time, that take what they call an experiential learning instruction approach, which is essentially hands-on activities, inquiry projects that are quite people-led, have a positive impact on social and emotional skills, things like self-confidence, self-management. The NFER evaluation from 2013, which evaluated a government summer school programme, is quite a good source of evidence for what a sort of national programme would look like. Also found really positive impacts on people's emotional and social well-being. And it's interesting that the pupils that attended actually reported themselves the social aspect of summer school was one of the most important aspects. So thinking about that in the context of those loneliness findings feels quite important. And finally, what I'll say is summer schools have been found to have a really positive impact on pupils that are transitioning into, say, like year 7 from year 6. And those pupils are particularly important to think about at the moment because they might have had a particularly difficult time during this school closure. But I think all pupils might be experiencing what pupils transitioning within a normal year usually experience. I think if you've not been in school since March, then your nerves about going back in September could be likened to those year 7 pupils. And so the findings about how summer schools can support pupils transitioning shows us that really important things include giving pupils opportunities to discuss their concerns about coming to school in September, and explaining to pupils the support that's available in very practical terms. So I think if we take those learning about transition and translate it to all pupils at the moment, we can see how those kind of features of a summer school could be potentially really beneficial for pupils in terms of their well-being. So thank you for listening to that whistle-stop tour of the research on that side of things. And I'm now going to pass on to Jonathan to tell us a bit about what summer schools can do for pupils. Thanks very much, everyone.
Hi, thanks, Ellie. So yeah, I'm John. I work at the Education Endowment Foundation, primarily on the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, but also across our evaluation reports. And I'm briefly going to discuss the evidence around summer schools and academic attainment. So this is taken from a number of sources, primarily the Global Evidence Review that makes up the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, but also some of the randomized control trials that the EF has funded in English schools. So what does the evidence say overall? The Teaching and Learning Toolkit summarizes the global evidence and finds an average impact of around 2 months progress. It's an area that has been evaluated quite extensively. The evidence rating is extensive. And it's also a finding that's been replicated in English school settings. So the average impact across the 3 trials that the EF has run is also 2 months progress. And one of the things that makes this evidence base more secure is there's a really clear theory of change about how summer schools might lead to beneficial outcomes for pupils. So just that additional provision puts it in contrast to some other education interventions that might take pupils out of regular classrooms in order to deliver an intervention. But obviously that additional provision also comes with a cost that needs to be balanced out. But probably the more useful thing to do is look past the average of the evidence in order to identify what the evidence says about effective practice. So how can we get above that 2-month impact summarised in the toolkit? And there are a few top takeaways of effective practice that come out of the evidence pretty clearly. The main one is that if the aim of the summer school is to have an academic impact, and it needn't, there are plenty of other legitimate reasons to hold a summer school. But if the aim is to have an academic impact, then it really does need to have an academic component. So if the focus is on sports, it's unlikely to have that kind of academic impact. And the more intensive those academic components are, the higher the effects are likely to be. So intensive small group tuition that's provided by experienced teachers has higher effects, getting closer to that 4 months progress. In one of the trials we run, a kind of intensive model was Future Foundation Summer School had 2 75-minute lessons with pre-specified lesson plans in English and maths every single morning of the summer school. So that kind of level of intensive academic support. It's also worth thinking about applying the wider evidence base when conducting a summer school. So principles of good pedagogy are probably good principles of pedagogy regardless of whether it's taking place in a summer school or a regular setting. So that includes things like providing high quality feedback, like encouraging metacognitive skills and self-regulation skills. It also might be worth thinking about elements that might have been missing over the period of school closures. So a good example is there's lots of evidence on the value of classroom talk, of high quality interactions. So thinking about ways that you can promote opportunities for pupils to talk about the work they're doing and talk with other pupils. We have good evidence from interventions like dialogic teaching, as well as the oral language interventions evidence base more generally. It's also worth talking a bit about the challenges that are identified in the evidence base. So one of the key challenges is targeting learning effectively. And this is a challenge even in regular summer schools. So summer schools often have different groups of pupils, often have different staff interacting with those groups. And one of the challenges we found in our evaluations is making sure that material is taught to the right level of pupils. So quickly trying to identify what level pupils are at is going to be crucial. Obviously, that's going to be even more difficult at a time when we know that people have been learning at different rates during lockdown. And another kind of challenge identified by the literature, which I think people go on to talk about a bit more later, is the challenge of motivation and recruitment. So in a lot of our trials, we've really struggled to get pupils to come to summer schools. And then once we've got them there, we've really struggled to actually retain them and keep them engaged in the summer schools. So thinking about ways that you can encourage motivation is going to be really important. Good examples of things that people have done is trying to blend some of that, some things like art, some things like sports alongside academic components is a good way of keeping motivation high. It's also going to be really important to think about managing behaviour, because places where pupils end up demotivated, times of the year where pupils aren't used to learning, often present different behavioural challenges to a regular classroom. It's worth noting here that this is evidence that's taken from a different setting. So maybe it's going to be a lot easier to get pupils motivated and engaged in a summer school when they haven't been at school in the months leading up to it. So it may be non-analogous evidence, but then there may be different challenges that come alongside bringing pupils in to this new environment. And again, I think that the kind of early assessment and identification of pupil needs is going to be so crucial there. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the evidence. As I said, it's a secure evidence with a positive impact, but plenty of things to consider about how to maximize that impact.
Great, thank you. And it's so important to start with the research and what the research says. And now we're going to turn to some real life case studies and examples. So Rosanna, from your experience with Head Start, what do you think is one of the most important things to consider when planning a summer school?
Yeah, so what we looked at when we were writing the guide, and from the experience that we've had through running summer schools through Head Start, is this idea of having a clear purpose and making sure that you have a clear and overarching aim for the summer school. So in deciding on that purpose, there might be things that you might want to consider, like what existing provision already exists in the area, so that you're not doubling up, making sure that it targets a different group of pupils, a different age group perhaps. You might want to consider what the priorities of the school are overall, and maybe helping to tie in with that, and also thinking about who else may wish to have a say in defining the purpose. So one thing we suggested in the guide was to come up with an 8-word mission statement to help you kind of clarify exactly what it is you want to do in your summer school, and also give you something that you can then evaluate on at the end to see if you've been successful in your goal of the summer school. So for us at Head Start, that was to get North East GCSE students learning ready for September. So our aims were to look at tackling summer learning loss and holiday hunger, and we particularly picked out the transition from year 10 to 11. We felt we'd have the most impact with that group. We'd spoken with some local head teachers who'd sort of pointed us in that direction, and as a small organisation that Head Start are, that was kind of where our expertise lay in sort of secondary teaching. From there, we kind of worked our way through, when we were discussing the guide, the steps that we've got on screen there. This is on page 4 of the Summer School Toolkit that's available on the Teach First website as well. So once we defined our purpose, we then kind of moved on to looking at what the curriculum would look like for us. So we decided we would be focusing on English, Math, Science and MFL. Again, those were the sort of areas of expertise from the Head Start board. And we went through and looked at the year 10 curriculum, identified what core knowledge and skills would be most beneficial for pupils to have a solid grasp of going into year 11. So it wasn't teaching them new content, it was going over stuff that they'd already done to make sure that they were really secure in that going into year 11. The sessions themselves were focused a lot on retrieval practice. There was a lot of guided practice. And we were really fortunate with our volunteer numbers that we were able to work with very small groups. So pupils got a lot of support in the summer intervention. It was strongly academic focused, but we did want to have a sort of fun yet purposeful activity section built in as well. At Head Start, we bring pupils together from different local schools, so they don't all know each other already. So we felt it was important to include some kind of get to know you activities, so that they had that opportunity to get to know the others in their class that they might not already know. And we also wanted to kind of celebrate the amazing effort of these pupils to give up a week of their time in the summer holidays, as well as our teachers. So we started with an opening ceremony and invited in a sort of guest speaker to speak with the pupils and to sort of explain what they'd be doing that week. And we finished with a closing ceremony to celebrate their successes, and they all got certificates, and we had stuff for our teachers as well. The next little dot down, the targeting the right students, was also really important for us, and I think probably the steepest learning curve for us as well. It's a tricky one to make sure we get right. We initially looked at data from the school data from CISRA and from FFT to sort of identify the pupils that we felt would benefit most from intervention. But then we took that list to our pastoral staff, and they had a look at it to help us sort of define that further. And our sort of overarching message was always that we were selecting pupils who would benefit most and who would engage, because we wanted the pupils, you know, if staff are giving up their time to take part in this summer school, we want the pupils to be engaging and getting something out of it. The staff themselves, from a Head Start perspective, we're really fortunate. We've sort of grown out of the Teach First North East ambassador community, and we've been really fortunate with the support that we've had from ambassadors and participants in the North East, and have been able to staff the summer school through that. So we focused on the subjects that Teach First has offered in the North East, and that's helped us sort of identify our staff base. Beyond that, the schools that we work with have been fabulous, and we've had really good support from teachers that we've worked with there, and also the wider staff of the school. So in order to run the summer school, we need our site manager there, we need our catering team there, we need a secretary to help welcome students when they arrive and stuff, and have been really fortunate to have a lot of support from our host schools that way as well. I'm not going to steal Andrew's thunder. He's going to talk us through the last few points from a Head Start perspective, but I am going to pass over to Rebecca now to talk through a little bit about the purpose of the summer school at Reach and what they did there.
Thank you, Rosanna. So yeah, as Rosanna said, we have had a summer school at Reach Academy for a number of years now, and serves the other end of the spectrum. So we use it as a transition activity for students coming from year 6 into our year 7. We're actually an all-through school, and so we did a transition summer school for the first 6 years of the school, and now no longer have to do that because our primary students are coming straight through. But we've retained that model because we think it's a really powerful one and just kind of tweaked it. And we're going to be using it this year, which I'll come on to in a moment. In terms of the purpose of our summer school, it's for all of the incoming year 7, so we don't target any particular group of them. We meet them all on home visits and on primary school visits, and then we invite them all to come in for their summer school. And they know about it in advance. So when they come to open evenings, they know about it from older siblings and friends who've come. So they know that it's part of coming to our school, that they come to a summer school. And we did the summer school at the end of July. So when they finish their primary school, they come to us straight away at the end of July and just into August, depending on how their school calendar falls. Rather than we didn't do it before September. And the reason that we did it that way around was because what we found in our community was that a lot of families and a lot of the children who were transitioning from year 6 to year 7 were really anxious over the summer period. And what the summer school did was it removed all of that anxiety, got their uniform sorted, did all of the things that cause anxiety over the summer, and meant that they then left summer school feeling really successful and being really excited about September. And it meant that we could hit the ground running in September. And it also meant that we as teachers could then go away over the summer and do some planning and do some thinking about the children that we had actually met and engaged with, rather than trying to guess who was going to turn up or use information that we'd sort of triangulated from primary schools and from different places, but without actually teaching the children for a solid period of time, which inevitably throws up more interesting and useful information. So the aims were to get the children really excited about school in September, to give us actual data on children that had been in front of us, so that we could plan effectively moving forwards. And then as a side kind of purpose, we use it to induct new staff into the school. So the staff would also come after they'd finished at their old school and join us for that first 10 days to 2 weeks of the summer holidays, get to know the routines, get to know the staff, build relationships, do handovers with old staff from form tutors and things like that. So there was a lot of information sharing during that period of time. We explicitly didn't use it for academic purposes. So there was no part of our summer school which we said was going to lead to academic gains for the children. What we believe is that the habits, the relationships, the foundations that are laid during the summer school mean that the academic gains can then happen from September onwards. So that was our purpose really explicitly. So we designed the curriculum with that in mind. We have lessons that are called English and maths and science, but really what we're doing through those lessons is teaching habits for learning, teaching behaviour systems, teaching routines, teaching how to have relationships, teaching how to talk to each other in a classroom, all of the things that are necessary for learning in September. And lots of structured opportunities for play and for building relationships with each other and with their teachers. And the main aim was to really kind of see themselves as learners and to see themselves being successful once they came to school in September. In our community, a lot of the young children who are coming to us from year 6 have had a pretty unsuccessful time at primary school and really don't see themselves as learners. And what we wanted to do was change that, give them books to read over the summer, talk to them as though they are going to be really successful in September so that they start to change their mindset and believe that. And the other thing we did, which Jonathan mentioned, was set really clear behaviour systems and expectations. And we did that really gently. So thinking about kind of setting routines, forming habits. For the first few days, we don't talk about sanctions at all. We only talk about rewards. And we layer those rewards up from individual rewards to group rewards and short-term to long-term rewards. And then as we move through the 2 weeks, we start to layer in, this is what would happen in September if you were to talk over a classmate. This is what would happen if you were to stand up in your chair when someone was talking, that kind of thing, a sort of fake scenario, social stories based method. So that when we get to September, we can say to the children, oh, do you remember in summer school when you talked over somebody, what did we say would happen then? So that it's just kind of layering up their knowledge of all of this. As I said, we use summer school to induct new staff and we pay them at a day rate for them to come in. For existing staff, if you're a member of senior leadership, then it's contracted that you work summer school. And any other member of staff can take annual leave in exchange for some of the summer school days. So we allow them to take term time leave if they work some of the summer school to do that handover, because we think that's really valuable. And this year, we will be using this model not to do a transition summer school for year 6 into year 7, but we're going to be using this kind of model to do the re-entry transition for all of the children. So we're going to be thinking really carefully about the lessons we've learned from doing summer school for 6 years and how do we translate that into, as Ellie said, year 7 to 8 transition, year 8 to 9 transition, because we think that lots of the lessons are really applicable to what all of the children will be going through in their return to school in September. I look forward to taking questions on any of that. Thank you.
Great, yeah, there have been some questions sent in already. So again, if you're watching and you have got a question, please come forward and type that in and we'll cover them at the end. So we've heard a bit about the research that sits behind summer schools and the possible impact of them. And we've also heard from Rosanna and Rebecca on those 2 case studies of what it might look like in practice. So Andrew, if I was watching this webinar now and I was thinking and contemplating about a summer school for this July or August, what are the logistical things that need to be considered, and how do we get children to attend?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the main logistical challenges that sort of hasn't been touched as much upon so far is how do you attract students to the summer school and how do you make sure that they keep on coming? As John mentioned, that is attendance and retention is one of the biggest challenges that summer schools face. So in terms of attracting students, I think there's two sides to the same coin. You've got to attract students themselves and you've got to get their parents on board as well. So I think in terms of attracting the students themselves, it's helpful to think about the question, why bother? That might be the question that they're asking themselves. Why am I bothering to give up some time of my summer holidays to come into the summer school? And I think to answer that question, it would go back to the purpose of your summer school, as Rosanna was talking about earlier. So for us at Head Start, why bother? Well, because we're going to help you get a head start to your GCSE year and make sure that you succeed in your exams. We'll give you the best possible preparation for it. And then in terms of addressing what parents might ask about that, I think they're coming at it from a slightly different perspective in terms of what is it that is unique that we can offer to them, because they might be thinking, why am I going to send my students to the summer school rather than taking an extra week's holiday, or maybe even getting them a tutor, or whatever other options they have. So thinking through the unique selling points of your summer school is really important in attracting parents to it. So for us at Head Start, it's very much that idea of small group tuition, intensive academic support. Normally, in normal school time, you'll have one teacher to 30 students. At the Head Start Summer School, we can offer one teacher to every 2 or 3 students, and that's our unique selling point. In terms of the practicalities then, in terms of attracting students and retaining attendance, we've learned a really valuable lesson in terms of having frequent communications with the parents of the students attending, particularly if your summer school, like ours, is done at the back end of the summer holidays, where there's maybe been a long time between the end of the term and the summer school starting. So we have a range of letters that go out at different points. We have an invitation letter, an acceptance letter once their application place has been confirmed, a phone call before the summer school, and also sort of text confirmations which go out the week before and then the night before the summer school, just to check that the parents are okay with logistics and are still planning to send their students to our summer school. And then, again, so particularly important if your summer school is at that back end of the holidays where they might not have heard from you in a while. And in terms of retaining attendance once you've got them there, as any good teacher will know, so much comes down to relationships. So it is worth planning in, as Rosanna alluded to earlier, structures for the staff or the teachers to build those relationships with the students. So whether that's icebreakers or encouraging the teachers to eat meals with the students, whatever is useful to enable that quick building of relationships, particularly as you'll probably have many teachers teaching students who they don't ordinarily teach. And then linked to that is just making sure that the timetable is very purposeful. It doesn't necessarily have to be dry and academic, but it can be broken up with purposeful engagements, whether that's doing some sports or doing something a bit more creative alongside your more intensive components. So that's a brief run through some of the logistics of attracting students to the summer school. Just one more aspect of logistics to talk about. I imagine many of you looking to run a summer school will be interested in how you can do this for your most disadvantaged students, or maybe the most vulnerable students. So then just thinking about what barriers you might need to remove to enable those students to come. So at Head Start, for example, we made sure that students had access to transport to the summer school if they needed it. So we bought lots of our students a bus pass. We provided taxis for others. We made sure there was breakfast and lunch at the summer school, so it wouldn't be embarrassing for anyone who turned up without any food, and also so everyone could eat together and have that community feel. And we also made sure that we had all the resources in terms of pens, papers, calculators already provided, so that, again, no one would turn up and feel embarrassed that they didn't have any. Yes, that's all I've got, so I'll hand back over to Dennis.
Thank you. That's great. Andrew, just before you do go off, I think you answered there around resources and providing things for pupils. How do you manage that in terms of funding?
Yeah, so Head Start's a little bit different. We are our own organisation, so we're not funded through schools. So we have to raise our own funding. So the way that we did that was partly just through crowdfunding. So creating an online crowdfunding page and putting that out on our Twitter, through social networks. And we also did that through applying to some grants. So we applied to a grant in the Northeast called the Shine Trust, and they were able to give us some money. We got a local business, the Phoenix Partnership, to sponsor us, which is fantastic. So it takes a bit of time to look for it. I'm more than happy to help anyone who does need some support with that. But there definitely is money for this kind of thing out there if you are someone who's running this without much of a budget.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Bex, you mentioned a kind of 2-week summer school. Rosanna, you referred to a 1-week summer school. I guess interested to hear from you both your thoughts on length, and then Jonathan, if you have anything to add in terms of what the research says around the impact and the length of summer school. Rebecca, you first.
We've run ours anything from 5 to 10 days, school days. Just depending on how the kind of term dates work some years. Longer's better. We do half days, so we finish at 1 p.m. to give us time to have meetings with the parents in the afternoon.
Okay.
So through home visits and primary school visits, we identify families that might need additional support, so it gives us time to do that. I wouldn't say that we see a dramatically lower impact from doing it for 5 days. Like I think there's a trade-off either way. I think anything less than a week is probably not a summer school in terms of the kind of what you could package it as.
Sure.
But I think it works either way.
Great, thank you. Rosanna?
Yeah, I would agree with Rebecca in that, yeah, anything less than a week, I feel like we're just at the right level there. I think, ideally it would be more. We're in a really fortunate position that our summer school is staffed entirely by volunteers who are full-time teachers, and being very mindful of their time and their holidays. I think asking for more than a week's commitment to do that unpaid would just be too much of an ask. As a board, the group of us who run it as well, we all teach full-time as well. So I think mindful of our own and our staff's well-being, I think that's probably why we've kept it at a week. Although I can 100% see the benefit of stretching it to 2 if that were possible as well.
Great.
Can I just add that I think because we do ours in July, it has felt like if we go too much into August, that feels like we're pushing the limits of, as you say, kind of goodwill of people. I think the latest we've ever gone was around the 2nd of August, again, just because of kind of term dates. But that's what has stopped us going further. And also I think families take holidays generally during August. You'd start to get lower attendance, and ultimately you want as many children there as possible as well.
Of course. And Jonathan, in terms of the research, what can you tell us?
Sure, yeah. So there isn't actually good analysis that analyses by differential length. The 2 trials that I mentioned both took place over 4 weeks, so they were longer interventions. Obviously, there's lots of trade-offs to be made. So the cost trade-off is a big one, and one of the challenges of summer schools is making sure that they're cost effective, particularly in managing the workload of staff. And the other trade-off, as previously mentioned, is that one with engagement. So a longer period does allow you to build better relationships, to understand what levels children are learning at, to target material better. But obviously it also leads to more disengagement, particularly towards the end of the programme. So with those 4-week programmes, we found that only actually 10% of pupils attended every single day of the programme. So there are obviously a downside to longer programmes there too.
Great, thank you. Ellie, you mentioned kind of the range of experiences that pupils might have had during this period of the pandemic. Have you got any suggestions in terms of supporting those who might have had a particularly difficult time if they haven't had much interaction with school during this term?
Yeah, I think I'd have a fairly multi-layered answer to this, I'm afraid, and obviously none of it draws on how to support pupils after this particular experience because, unprecedented, as we said at the beginning. What I would say is that I think we have to accept that summer schools will act in part as support for pupils, but for pupils that have had a particularly difficult time during school closures, it will serve as a time to assess those needs and start planning for September. in which case I think that the support that they might need would need to be specialised. For example, if people's had a particularly difficult time because of a bereavement, then that support would need to be specialised, and therefore I couldn't quite sort of recommend on every particular avenue. And I think what will be good about doing summer schools is that you prep yourself to tailor that support for young people. But a very practical bit of advice that I think comes out in the guide, and that I would emphasise at this point, is that in order to provide support for pupils that have had a particularly difficult time, the summer school will need to be staffed accordingly. If you decide that you're going to have a pastoral focus and target pupils that you think are particularly vulnerable, then you'll need to have staff there that are able to deal with those situations and provide the support that pupils need, be that your SENCO, your behavioural team, pastoral specialist, depending on what you have in your team. If you're lacking in support like that within your staff team, some smaller schools, some primary schools in particular might be, then I think it would be worth thinking particularly about your specific pupils, and as a team in a school, planning for how you're going to ready yourself to deal with some of those really complex issues. So sorry not to give a really easy answer there, but I think staffing will be key.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. And Andrew and Rosanna, can you give any examples of where you've identified pupils that might need a bit of extra support during the summer schools, and what did you do about it?
I think at a pupil selection level, there was an incident last year where, you know, we'd sent out the letters, people had started inviting pupils, and there was a bit of chatter about it in school. And I was actually approached by one of the heads of house. We run a house-based pastoral system at my school, and was approached by one of the heads of house for a particular girl who'd expressed interest in it. So we hadn't specifically targeted her, but she'd spoken to him about it, and she struggles with her anxiety and some other mental health needs, and I think both he and her thought it would be a good opportunity for her to kind of ease back into school a little bit. So at Head Start, we follow the school day pretty much. It was sort of 9 till 3, and they could come in and get breakfast as they usually would on a school day, and with lunch as well. So I think that sort of situation was where it was, you know, she didn't necessarily fit our normal criteria for summer school, but it was it was a huge benefit for her, and she was the one, she turned up every single day, and I actually teach her as well, and I think it did make a big difference going into the start of year 11 for her.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Just to add to that, I think the high ratio of the number of staff available compared to the number of students also makes a massive difference in terms of just being able to take the time to support those more tricky students more easily.
Great. There's been a question that's come in around testing. So Rebecca, what are your thoughts on testing or the types of assessment that might be used or not used during a summer school?
Yeah, so we do baseline assessments in English and maths and science to enable us to meet one of the aims, which is planning effectively for September. They're useful, you know, as with any test, they're a snapshot in time, but it's useful to overlay on top of SATs results and information from primary school to just add another kind of level to the triangulation of the data on the student. And particularly the transition, for example, in English from what's needed to do well on the SATs paper and what is needed to be successful at secondary level English in GCSEs, for example, is quite different. And so it just helps us to kind of see where the gaps are. And then we also do a reading age test to, again, assess for gaps and, you know, make sure that they're reading the right level of book. Make sure that we have the right levels of books. When we first started, we had some students that were so low that we didn't have any books in our library that we just started. And so we had to quickly go out and purchase some books. So we had to kind of make some swift adjustments around that.
Great. That's really helpful. Thank you. And I'm just interested, there's been a question coming in around not the length of summer schools, but when. Have any of you come across summer schools that are around at the back end of summer, so ahead of September at all?
I know of schools that, sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. So the Head Start summer school is at the end of summer school, at the end of summer holidays. I think that helps. I mean, maybe John might have more to say on this, but I think that does help with if the aim is learning loss, then sort of jumping in when they've had some time to forget things is better than trying to make the intervention before they've forgotten it.
That's a really great point. Rebecca?
I was just going to say that I know of other schools that do summer schools like ours, and they do them at the start of the autumn term. Although I think I agree with Andrew. I think if the aim is learning loss, I can see a lot of value in just doing an extra 2 weeks or a week before September to kind of go over everything that you might have forgotten. Otherwise, if you do it at the end of July, you've sort of got the same problem coming in September anyway. Whereas the purpose of ours is to remove that anxiety over the summer, and so it's really important for us that we do it the other way around, rather than try and teach them something.
I think as well, when we were looking at Head Start's purpose of getting them school ready for September, I think for that to us was making sure that they were kind of back into the routine, as I said, sticking to the school day routine, particularly for teenagers who've been sleeping in all summer holidays. It was a real shock to the system for them during summer school to try and get into school for 9. So I think that kind of preparedness worked well in terms of us having the summer school at the end of the summer for them.
Okay. And yeah, Jonathan, is there anything from the research to suggest timing of when at all?
I guess that the only thing is being able to very early on, if you're holding a summer school later in the summer, being able to quickly identify the differential levels of pupils is a particular challenge. Obviously, the longer summer schools, the 4-week summer schools, tend to necessarily end up towards the end of summer because they're 2/3 of the school holidays in and of themselves. So yeah, there certainly are examples. Given the theory of change for summer schools is largely just about additional provision, there isn't a reason why putting that provision earlier or later would be especially good or bad. But yeah, there are different pros and cons in terms of engagement, in terms of assessing people at the initial stage of the summer school.
Great, thank you. We've had a question come in around community interest companies and running summer schools within schools that you don't necessarily normally operate in. Andrew, Rosanna, any nuggets of wisdom to share from your experiences?
I think for us, it's communication was the most important thing there, making sure that we had a lead contact in each of the schools, and that being a person who's got enough time to dedicate to running the summer school as well. So often our initial contact would be the head teacher, but then it was often best for that to fall into somebody else's remit who has more spare time than a head teacher would to help dedicate to the program, and making sure that the communication was constant, it was open. I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Andrew. I think that was the top tip from our perspective.
Yeah, and I think we were very encouraged by how easily students from very different schools got on with each other quite quickly. Yeah. So it is definitely something really valuable to do if you can do it.
Great. There's a question also around running summer schools for multiple year groups. Rebecca, do you want to start us off on your experience of doing that?
Yeah, so we've not explicitly run summer schools in the model that I described for multiple year groups, but we've had students from different year groups in the summer school for the year 6 to year 7 transition. So it's quite a kind of coveted role, and or you might have to give up some of your holiday if you need to kind of do a bit of extra learning, and then you can also help out the year 6s and feel important. And that's worked really well, having kind of older mentors, other students there, wearing full school uniform, looking like Reach Academy students, feeling important. That works really well both ways. So for some of our more vulnerable children, that's actually a really valuable leadership opportunity for them as well. So yeah, it can work, but we've not explicitly done a summer school for mixed age groups.
Great. And I guess just for clarity, all 3 of our contributors have been running summer schools for years gone by. So this isn't necessarily a reactive solution as a result of coronavirus. Yeah, there's a really interesting question being put on the chat around resisting simplistic solutions. Just wondered if any of our panelists have any thoughts around you know, the fact that summer schools won't be a golden bullet or silver bullet to solving the disadvantage or attainment gap?
I'm happy to talk on that, particularly as my colleague Robbie is mentioned in the question. So very happy to talk about that. So at the EF, I think our perspective is certainly that summer schools are definitely not going to close completely the attainment gaps that have happened over the period of school closures. That isn't a reason not to do summer schools. That's a reason to do things in addition to summer schools. So things like high quality tutoring support. We recently published our COVID support guide that has a number of different strategies, and summer support is one of those strategies. I think it's going to be up to schools to work out, given their resources, the best ways to implement programs to support pupils, particularly disadvantaged pupils, over the coming months. And summer schools are certainly one kind of intervention, but they're not the only one. They won't be appropriate for every school, but they're certainly something worth considering, particularly, as I said, because they are that additional provision. And a lot of the other programs, a lot of the other supports will involve taking pupils out of classes and providing them with different interventions. So it's certainly a kind of unique solution to consider in the overall arsenal to try and overcome the problems of the disadvantage gap given the school closures.
So definitely used as part of a range of solutions and support. Thank you. There's also a question around making use of older students. So Andrew, Rosanna, you mentioned using teachers from a range of schools. Have you experimented with peer mentors or older pupils to support your summer schools at all?
We haven't done, no. But yeah, I definitely thought when Rebecca mentioned it, that sounds like a really good idea, particularly in terms of building the confidence of other students and helping place them in a leadership position.
Great. And Rebecca, yeah, can you talk to us just a bit more, unpack, you know, the benefits of doing what you said?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple benefits. So what we traditionally did was we would ask the older students to apply. And so that in itself kind of elevates the status of the opportunity. And then there are some other students, as I said, who perhaps are behind. And so we want to give them a bit of extra time. But in order to do that, we also want to make them feel like their time is valued because it's their summer holidays. And so helping to elevate them into a leadership position is really valuable. And we use the students in a mixture of ways. So we would use them to read with the younger students. We would use them as teaching assistants. We would use them to model behavioural expectations in classrooms. So like on one of the first days, we do some activities where we teach them like how to kind of raise their hand properly, like straight up in the air. It's all very kind of primary school friendly. And so the older students would model it again and do it in a really fast way. And then the other thing we do is we use those older students to help make a video which we show to parents at the end of summer school, and we show to the students where everyone has like a section where they're dancing. There's shout outs, so the older students are giving shout outs and saying well done to the younger students. So it's just a really nice, it just makes them feel like part of a school rather than just this kind of microcosm that's a bubble that's summer school. It makes them feel like they're part of a bigger institution when there are older students talking about the normalities of school life and wearing their uniform. I think it adds weight to the experience.
Great. And have you run them solely in-house, or have you had any support from external providers in delivering your summer schools?
Shall I go first? Because we don't have any support from external providers. I was thinking about this in terms of the question about kind of it not being a simplistic solution. Like the common thread between Andrew and Rosanna's Head Start programme, which has really great ratios so that great relationships can be built, and off the back of that great learning can happen. And the thread with ours is that those relationships that are being built, the ratios aren't so good because they're just regular kind of classroom ratios, but the relationships are really meaningful because the staff and the students are really invested because they know these are going to be the relationships for September. And so the thread with both of those is relationships, which is why I think summer schools, the kind of idea of summer schools is really valuable at the current time, because this idea that students can just transition back to school without having those really solid relationships underneath them as foundations, I think like we would be remiss to think that. And so whatever people that are listening are taking from this, I think what I would hope they're taking is that like relationships and having secure relationships, I believe, is the thing that's going to lead to children closing the disadvantage gap, but also the recovery from the fallout of COVID. It's going to be around relationships, is my view.
We did use external providers for sort of some quite specific activities, and very much sort of using the Teach First network within that. So we had the local MP came and sort of gave an opening ceremony speech and just told the students how brilliant they were to be turning up during the holidays, and I think that really encouraged them. We had someone from the civil service come in and talk about how they used maths in their job and how it was really helpful to them in their career. And we also had someone from NHS England come in and talk about mental health and sort of well-being during exams. So I think it definitely is, particularly I guess for our students who are a little bit older and maybe looking towards career and looking towards other things, there is definitely space for bringing in external providers as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Jonathan, there's definitely on here a question I've seen popped up around the different ages of pupils and accessing summer schools. What can you tell us about the benefits for different year groups?
Sure. So most of the research on summer schools has happened around the transition between primary and secondary school. That's where we've seen lots of positive effects. There hasn't been lots of great analysis done breaking down the impacts on older pupils. That's probably a gap in the research, particularly in the English school system, where those kind of older age summer schools are probably less common. And one of the kind of areas to be cautious, I think, is that generally we find that moving the attainment of older pupils is harder anyway. So more generally in all classroom interventions, moving attainment for older pupils is harder. So it's going to take more of those intensive interventions and a lot more of targeting support really carefully when you're dealing with older pupils.
Thank you. And I'm really conscious of time. I think we can squeeze one more question in. There is a practical question, so maybe Andrew or Rebecca, starting off, could answer it around coronavirus and measures being taken around working maybe outside with pupils. Rebecca, what are you doing at your school?
We aren't running a summer school this side of summer. As I said, we're going to kind of do that aspect of things in September. A lot of our summer school is outside anyway, because we, try to fit in a lot of outside time and getting to know you games and all of that stuff can be done outside. I think if the students were older, and maybe Andrew, Rezani, you'll disagree with me, but it feels easier if they're older. You could still kind of have 3 students and a teacher around a bench outside and your learning wouldn't be that negatively impacted. I think with our students, if we're thinking about younger ages and getting them used to sitting at desks in classrooms, like that is relatively important in terms of the outcomes of the summer school. So I think there are aspects that would need to be compromised depending on guidance, but certainly a lot of things could be done outside. Or we're going to have our parent consultation day, which is like our open evening. We're going to have that under gazebos in the playground this side of summer, because we can't do it inside. So there's always a solution to these problems.
Yeah, so at Head Start, we aren't running a summer school this year either. I guess for similar reasons. What's a little bit different is that because we are an external provider, essentially, we come into a school, we work with multiple schools. It's a lot harder for us, I think, to make the sell to parents of trust us to, manage these risks properly, particularly in this current context. So that's why we decided against it. Saying that, I think I imagine the scale of a summer school, what that looks like in a school, is fairly similar to what's happening in schools at the moment. So maybe schools are quite well placed to do this, even if Head Starts aren't. So what we are doing instead is we're running an online tutoring program, which again focused at year 10 students going into year 11. So hopefully still able to make up some of that learning as well.
Great. And the final word is going to Ellie. So can you point us to any wider research around the impacts of recent events on pupils and any reflections you've had from today's session.
I can. I think probably the easiest way to do that, and I hope it's okay for everybody listening, is to send out the slides that I used earlier, because I've linked to the variety of research, because there's actually quite a lot. We've done at the Centre for Education and Youth ourselves a study with the University of Exeter, which asked young people, mainly sort of age 16, 17, 18, about their experiences of lockdown. And we're going to be publishing that quite soon, and that's got some really interesting findings in terms of what I found particularly interesting. My main reflection is what some young people talking about the benefits of being at home for their learning tells us about what we can think about more generally in schools beyond summer schools. So that's coming up, and I'll send around the rest of the stuff, because there's quite a lot of surveys about young people, a lot of negative findings in terms of their anxiety and loneliness, which I guess is to be expected, but also that really interesting positive side as well. And my reflections on this session would just be a massive thanks to everybody, really, really practical stuff, and keen to see how people find it this summer, and what good can be done.
Definitely. Thank you all for joining us, for those who have logged in to access this webinar, or those who are watching it back with the recorded version. And a special thank you to all of our expert panelists for your insight and for your time. We wish you the best if you are planning a summer school, and would love to hear back from you on your success in doing so. Thank you for joining us, and take care.